depending on your time zone.
Morning.
Good morning, that works. Welcome to Building Secure Apps. I'm Yuri.
I'm Justin.
We're solutions architects working with our government
Healthcare, nonprofit.
and education customers. Doing this, of course, for AWS, because there's probably our logo somewhere. This is episode 1 of 5 on Twitch. It's going to be a weekly series. Where, starting off today, we're going to be covering the basics of going from a blank AWS account and putting some security in place, like maybe the people who may need to work on your application, making sure that they have the right access
At the right time.
to the right things. So before we get into all of that, let's start off with some housekeeping items, which is everything that we're going to talk about today is going to be covered in a blog. A link is about to go into the chat session that you are seeing associated with this Twitch video. And since this is Twitch, we are encouraging you to ask us as many questions as you can throughout the episode. And we will try to answer it either right there in the chat, or those questions might be surfaced to Justin and I. The people who are helping us out on this episode are in our lounge. Ted and Mike.
Hi, my name's Ted.
Hi, I'm Mike.
They're helping us out, moderate everything that you guys are saying, and facilitating our discussion today. Shall we get into it?
Let's get started.
Blank AWS account, what does that mean?
So when you create an AWS account, well, let's start and back up a little bit. So this might be a little basic to some of you if you already have an AWS account, or if you've been in an AWS environment before. And some of these things might be taken care of by your security team or your central IT shop or cloud team or
Those people you work
whatever.
with who have security in mind and are helping you out. But you need to be part of that process.
Right. So when you create a new AWS account, and I'll show my screen here, this is a fresh AWS account in the AWS console. You get this. You sign in with a username, a password, and a credit card or a billing, some sort of billing construct to set up the account.
And the idea is these are your root credentials.
Right.
Root. That sounds like just if you were like ever in a Linux environment before, root's kind of powerful, isn't it?
You can do anything as root in the AWS console. You can spin up resources, you can terminate resources. There's a little more to it than that, but there's an awful lot that the person who is in this logged in as root can do.
And when we are talking about those resources, those can be compute servers,
Yes.
or EC2 instances.
Databases.
Those can be databases, everything that can support your application running. Now, of course, you only want the right people to be accessing and maintaining your application.
That's right.
So we need to know who those people are.
Well, we need to know who those people are, and we need to make sure that they have the right access. And signing in as root might work if you've got one person doing one thing at one time, as long as you don't make any mistakes. Seems a bit unlikely. So the very first thing to signing in and securing your account is creating an administrative user.
Yes. So this way, hopefully,
Yes.
you don't have to sign in as root, hopefully ever again.
Right. So I'm going to do that real quick. I've got a brand new, fresh account created. I'm going to create a user. You'll see here on the left side of my screen, there's groups, users, and roles, policies. We're going to talk about all of that. And you might be thinking, I'm a developer. Why do I need to know? Because it's helpful to understand how all of this fits together and how you access the resources you need to do your development in a secure fashion. So I'm going to add a user real quick. I'm going to put my name here. And I've got a decision to make right away. Do I want programmatic access or console access? Now this is the console that we are in. I'm going to say I want console access. Do I want an auto-generated password? Yes, I do, because I don't want to type one in. And I'm going to require a password reset, which actually requires a certain policy attached to the user so you can change the password.
Right.
Which is called out right there. So I hit next, and it's setting the permissions. Now, it's great that I can give an individual user permissions directly, right? But what if I have 2 people on my team?
Yeah.
Or 20?
And what happens if you have multiple people who have the same role or same function on your application? Examples could be database administrators.
Yep.
Instead of having one, you might have a group of them. It could be
Right.
your developers.
Yes.
It could be your operations and testing team.
Could be security.
Yeah. So the idea is instead of assigning policies to just one user, instead you can assign it to a group so that everyone who's a member of that group can have the same level of access.
So I don't have any groups in my new account, but it gives me the option of creating a group right now. So let's do that. Very straightforward. So group name, I'm going to say admin. It's a good group to create first.
Especially with the policy associated. That makes sense.
And you'll see here that we have policies to choose from. I can either create a new policy, but for the admin role, I want pretty broad powers attached to this particular group. So my policy name, I'm going to go with administrator access. And you'll see here that it's got a type of job function. This is designed to give you full access to AWS services, and you can see the description there in the role. So I'm going to select that policy, and I'm going to create the group with that policy attached. Right? So that group has been created, the attached policies are there, and I'm going to tag that group now. Now this is not a requirement, but you can put any key value in there within the limits. And that can be useful for tracking things, that you can take actions on policies. Maybe I want to find it a little easier in my logs. We'll talk about that later. And then I click there, review. And I'm going to create a user with the following group, with the following managed policy attached to that user directly. And
That sounds correct. So I think
That's
we
it.
can proceed.
there we go.
Perfect. So now we've created our first administrator user. Now I feel like we should do something to ensure that our root user can never be abused. Is there any place in AWS that might tell us about certain things we can do to start following security best practices?
Fortunately, there is.
What would that be?
One of the places to go to look for this sort of thing is Trusted Advisor. And Trusted Advisor, it provides a number of checks from cost optimization here, all the way through performance, security, and fault tolerance. We're going to focus just on security today because that's what we're all here for.
But the idea is almost, if you have on your account a solutions architect that's already associated with you, we tend to give a lot of advice that matches what's here in Trusted Advisor.
Right.
But we wanted to make sure that this was accessible to everybody in an easy fashion.
Right. And this does, you'll see a number of checks kind of across the board here. But the very first check, I've got my screen blown up so you can see it a little bit. This is actually, if I'm going to put it back to normal size here, MFA on root is red. And it's being called out right here. This is a problem.
Red normally means bad. Red normally
Means
you
stop.
always it means stop. And normally we like to get that to be green.
I mean, I try and
Is there any
stop
advice?
at all the red lights.
Yeah. Is there any advice around there?
There is. So
getting
it actually has the alert criteria and the recommended action. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my IAM console, and I'm going to set up an MFA right now. I go to my dashboard and
Wait,
right
did
here.
we get into what MFA is? Because that sounds like an acronym.
It is, and we should call out all the acronyms.
I know, we love acronyms.
We
We work
do.
with lots of customers who have acronyms everywhere, but we will
do.
do our best to explain them.
So MFA is multi-factor authentication. This is a YubiKey.
Yep.
This is a U2F token. Yeah, I think I put all those in the right order. And this is part of a multi-factor authentication that is supported by AWS.
Yep. We also support things like Google Authenticator.
We do. If you want a virtual MFA, that is an option.
Yep, Gemalto
The
tokens.
Gemalto tokens are something I've carried around for a very long time now.
Right. So just if you already have one incorporated into your life, well then you can integrate that into your multi-factor authentication for your root account.
So we have here in the IAM console this button, Manage MFA. You'll see that this is telling me best practice using IAM, using MFA, especially for root. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to continue my security credentials right here. There's a password that I need to change and set, and policies around that. But I'm looking for this multi-factor specifically. I'm going to click this. And I'm going to say I have a U2F right here, security key, a YubiKey. This is where I'd select like a Gemalto token. And you can see here all of the different devices supported for multi-factor authentication. So
That's useful. So the idea is that we're going through a lot of security best practices right now, but the idea is just remember Trusted Advisor. Go to Trusted Advisor, and you will probably see a lot of the guidance that we all are
Absolutely.
telling you today, in
So
addition to our blog.
So you see here on the console, I just set up my U2F security key. It is now required for signing in, which makes my account a little more secure. Now, what I'm going to do, because this is a root account, is I'm going to take this and I'm going to put this somewhere else.
Yeah.
Right? This is a root account. I've got an administrative user. That's really what I want to use when I'm doing anything in this account.
Yeah.
I only need to go into my root account to do a couple of things, and it's best practice to avoid that.
So things that we could be doing from here
Yes.
is setting up other groups
Oh, absolutely.
or other roles that are necessary for us to build our application. And we mentioned this before, something like your database administrators. That would be a key role. They can do everything like create databases possibly. They can administrate your databases. You might have application developers as another group. And for those application developers, maybe they can spin up EC2 instances, which are your compute servers. You might be able to do things like control load balancers.
Sure.
Those are things that
Those are pretty helpful things,
Yeah,
usually.
for those roles.
But it can go deeper than that. What we're talking about gets at the basic getting started. But with IAM, you can actually schedule things so that you only during certain times can certain people log in to the console to spin up those
Yeah.
roles. Or you can have tagging requirements put into place around that, and we'll look at some config rules later on with how to go about that.
Yeah. So the idea is we have some managed policies that are in place that you can use, but in addition to that, you can customize them to the needs of your application,
Absolutely.
to your company, anything along those lines. Speaking of which, now we have policies, we have groups. Let's think about the users. Why do we want to have specific users in our account that are associated with these groups?
Well, it's so we know who people are.
Yeah, because sometimes, on a good sense, you might want to see who is spinning up instances, who is using your resources. So it could be cost controls.
It could be cost controls.
It could be if there was oops, something went wrong, who did what, just so that we can go back and have a conversation with them, right? So the idea is we want to know who people are, because there is logging associated with every single thing that happens within AWS.
In fact, let's take a look at that. So the system that does that logging actually is called CloudTrail, right? And you'll see here, I've logged in a couple of times to this account and in the recent events, but I haven't actually done hardly anything in this account recently. Right? We've got a couple of things here in CloudTrail, but I haven't configured any trails. So let's do that real quick. Let's set up CloudTrail. This is a good idea, right? If we want to keep track of who's doing what and where they are, that's a good thing. So I'm going to call this trail name Twitch. And we're going to assume that applies to what we're doing now.
Yes, that sounds about right.
We're going to set up read-write events all. And this is the management event providing insights. Here you see that we've got data events from a resource perspective, object level API activity, which can be pretty helpful. But I need to put it somewhere, so I can just select track this. I'm going to select all S3 buckets, but I need to store all of this CloudTrail goodness somewhere. So I'm going to create an S3 bucket real quick. It gives you the option to do that. I'm going to say
S3 is our simple storage service.
Oh, thank you.
Think about it as your object level store. The way it looks for your browser is you have a bucket, but in any other system, you might have think about it as like a folder, and then you will have objects inside of that. But you can think of these objects as they can be CSV documents, they can be anything that you want. They can be images, but in this case, it's our CloudTrail logs.
Yep. So I've created a trail that's going across all regions in this account. It's not an organization level trail. We're going to talk about organizations here in a minute, but it's pushing all of the logs into this S3 bucket. And I could have defined a few things here under the advanced tab, like a prefix as it goes into the bucket, but I've not done that.
So we have a question.
Oh,
Yeah, so ddorf 716. What would you need a write-only event for?
they did catch that. That's a good question. So let me go back to setting up a new trail, and we can dig into that. See, we've got the ability to say read-write events, a read-only, a write-only, and a none. And if you add, those questions can be answered in sometimes a tooltip pop-up or
Learn more.
a learn more. Now, this goes into depth on the management events. And if you look here, read-only events include the API operations that read your resources but don't make changes.
So in this case, a write-only, those would be modifications to resources
Correct.
in your AWS account. So you can think about this as going back to our prior examples, creating a database that is it's creating something from scratch.
Sure.
Doing things like modifying your database. It could be things like you're adding storage to your database. You're increasing the size of compute that your database can handle.
Yep.
Those would be write events.
Yep.
Things like reads would be maybe if you have an S3 object and someone is looking at it. So they are not actually changing it at that.
Right, and the reason you would want to, one of the reasons you might want to do that is, let's say you have an awful lot of activity in this account. Well, if you have a specific CloudTrail doing read-only, maybe you're looking for something and you're narrowing down and eliminating some of the, to you, for that particular purpose, noise that is in the logs you have to look through.
Yeah, and one of the benefits of using AWS is we have a lot of eventing that you can do and actions you can take. So you can make sure that your logs don't just be, they're not just logs for the sake of racking up a
Right.
storage bill. Instead, you can make them action oriented. So you can do things along the lines of only paying attention to all modifications into your AWS account. And for certain types of modifications, you can alert or take immediate remediation on certain events happening. So an example of this would be security. We are talking about security.
You're talking about security. That's
If you
what
have
we're
like a security group
Yes.
and somebody ever opens up a port which will allow access to certain ports that you want to always have locked down, you can have, again, certain types of alerts on write-only events to your security groups.
Yep.
So not anytime someone goes and looks at your security group,
No.
instead they go and change your security group. And it could be something like you immediately change it back to what you want, or you send off an email to the right people so that they can go through and take a look.
That's where somebody gets paged.
Yeah.
But there's always these learn more links, which actually take you to relevant portions of our documentation. So for those types of questions, it's in the console to the documentation to give you a little bit of context.
Yeah, and Mike actually has some additional insights. Would you like to share it around the case of
Yeah.
the write-only events?
Absolutely. So if you think about the way that we would create for a compliance trail, typically you think of, I need an immutable audit log trail to be able to ensure that admins or bad actors aren't influencing the way that my security audit trail is being kept. And so having a write-only would allow for those resources to write in, but not be able to make any read edits or changes to any timestamping that's going on. And then from a read-only perspective, that would be more for an auditor role. So someone who's coming in and looking at it, but doesn't necessarily need to change anything within that log structure.
That totally makes sense.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Good stuff.
Yeah. Okay, so we've gone through the idea of logging and the fact that the reason why we even went down the path of logging is knowing who is affecting your AWS account and all the resources inside means makes a difference. So
Yes,
you need to know
absolutely.
who these people are. And this is, again, going back to the fact that we are creating groups that have roles. You're creating people inside these groups, and you're assigning them with the right permissions so that they can only act on the right things. And when one of the people in your organization does change anything inside your AWS account, it's being logged and collected for you to be able to reference back later on. Now, the idea, we've been talking about people having access to your AWS account. What if your organization already has this collection of people, maybe in something
Ooh.
like Active Directory? Do we need to repeat that in AWS, or is there something easier that we can do?
Well, fortunately, we have several ways of connecting AWS to existing directories. We have a managed Active Directory service that you can extend a trust to. There's the Active Directory connector, which it's essentially a proxy that connects back to your existing Active Directory infrastructure. And then you can run Active Directory on AWS on EC2 if you prefer.
Yep. And so now we have the idea of, we have the people. Now, to ensure that these people are who they say they are, let's talk a little bit about passwords.
So passwords are fun.
Passwords are fun.
Are always important. So one of the things that you can do for either identity and access management is set an IAM password policy. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to set minimum password length of, let's say, 16.
What? I'm not allowed to use password 123 anymore?
No, not so much. Let's say 16. It's a bit extreme, but it is what it is. At least one uppercase letter, sure. At least one number.
But it was capital password 123.
That's secure. And you can see here allowing users to change their own password or disable that if that's what your organization requires. Enabling password expiration, a retention period over a particular set of days. Let's do 90 days because I don't want to do it every month.
Yes.
And then preventing password reuse. How many passwords should we prevent people from doing? So if it's 4 over 90 days, that's a fair number of passwords, but not the worst thing in the world, right?
We'll go with that.
All right. So password expiration requires administration reset.
Yeah.
Yeah? You think that's a good idea?
Sure.
All right. So I'm going to apply the policy.
So the idea is that you've gone through the burden of creating all of your users, making sure that they have the right access to the right resources, but you still want to make sure that they are who they say they are when they come through and do some sort of operation in your AWS account, like create a database. And for that, you need to make sure that their password is secure, because people are probably going to be able to guess their username.
Yeah. So passwords plus multi-factor authentication gets you some of the way there.
So that's perfect. So we're in public sector right now.
We are.
So we are talking about security because security means it makes a difference for every application, but especially in public sector.
It does.
It might mean a little bit more. So what sort of security considerations should people have up front? Where should they go before they even start thinking about their applications? Who should they talk to think about what level of security needs they have?
So if you're in an organization that requires you to meet some sort of compliance framework, you probably know that. We have a whole compliance page around compliance programs. Understanding the program that you're trying to hit gives you the ability to look at some of the white papers we publish on how to meet those compliance frameworks, and the white papers and workbooks that we publish. But also it gives you an idea of the person you need to talk to get there.
Yeah.
And one thing that we do stress is DevOps, DevSecOps is about the communication of those teams. Communicate with your security people. Talk to them when you start rather than when you've already built something halfway or when it's going in for an audit. Yeah,
or right before you're trying to go out to production. The whole point is your security teams are not meant to be the big scary people who are closed off and who only say no to you. Chances are that they have metrics that they want to hit around how fast can applications go into production, how fast can they go through and approve new services that you guys are building. But for them to be able to meet these metrics, they want to have conversations earlier with you so that before you ever start building, you are meeting their needs. And so you can build towards the right things. So
Absolutely.
Start talking to them about what are the security needs. Do I need something like FISMA high, FISMA moderate? It'll even tell you where you should put your, what sort of regions you should look at.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Where should you be building your resources?
Yeah, it helps to know.
It does. What are some of the other ones that we?
Well, we've got FedRAMP, of
Yes.
course. We've got FISMA, FIPS, CGIS, FERPA, HIPAA. That's a fun one.
So, if anyone's out there, are you thinking that AWS, you have these compliance certifications, authorizations, therefore if I use your stuff, I am good to go, and magically my security team is going to give me a green check. Is that reality?
Not really how it works.
What's the way that we should be thinking about building our applications with using an AWS that already has some of these certifications?
So that comes down to the shared responsibility model, and that is something very important to understand. We are responsible for a number of things from the AWS side, but understanding where your responsibility comes in is kind of key for making sure you're living up to your side of the agreement.
Yeah. And so the idea is that when you're building your application, you might be using EC2 as an example. You might
Absolutely.
be using RDS, which is our relational database service.
Right.
These may have, let's say, or they do, have FedRAMP compliance. But your application running in these environments, you still have to be able to communicate that to your security teams to make sure that you are abiding by their concerns.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So are there ways that applications can get a step further and closer to being things like NIST compliant, meeting their CIS benchmarks? Thinking about that, are there ways that they can be helped around this?
Well, there are. Fortunately, we have a NIST compliance framework, both white paper, workbook, and CloudFormation template to try out.
Yeah, you said the word CloudFormation. I
Let's
feel
dig into
like this
that.
deserves a little bit of time.
So CloudFormation is our templating service.
Yeah.
You declare resources and those and attach policies to them. You can declare IAM users and groups, and you hand it to the CloudFormation service, and the CloudFormation service will provision those resources.
I feel like we should take almost a step back to something you showed in the very beginning, which is when Justin was creating a user, he had the option of giving that user console access versus API access.
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Let's
so the idea is
take a look at that.
right. So everything that you do in the console, that's available to you through APIs. The console is actually using our APIs to operate, which is why we can do things like have an audit trail of every operation inside your AWS account. So every single thing that you touch in AWS is logged for you. And we can do this because everything goes through an API.
Yeah.
So with that, CloudFormation, it's basically letting you provision resources in your AWS account. It's using our API, but it's a shortcut. I think about it as a shortcut.
Yeah.
It's much easier to look at because
is
it's
much
things
easier to
like
look at.
YAML, things like JSON,
Yep.
a little bit easier than making tons of API calls.
Absolutely. And what I did just now is I pulled up the quick start for the NIST the compliance framework that we have, and I went to the CloudFormation quick start step. You see here where it says launch quick start. If you're signed into the console, when you do that, it will actually open. You can click on it, and it will open CloudFormation.
Yeah.
And it will populate the template right here in the link. So I can either view that in the designer, or I could just click next
Yeah.
and start giving some parameters, because you can pass CloudFormation parameters, which allows you to standardize on a particular template and then do some configuration if you have a different CIDR block that it needs to go into, or some slightly different requirements.
We have a question.
Oh, okay.
Randall at Amazon is asking, what's a CIS benchmark?
So,
Yeah. Should
Thank
we
you,
go to,
Randall.
I feel like we should go to the page just to,
Yeah.
to give a little bit of cred to CIS.
all right, let's do it.
Maybe. Did I just mess you up? I
No, that's
apologize. if I
okay.
did.
That's okay. I know it's on here somewhere. There's CISP, there's CIS.
There we go.
Hey, what do you know? So, Center for Internet Security
Yeah.
is what CIS
Yeah.
is.
So basically, it's an independent organization.
Yep.
And Mike, please feel free to just jump on in whenever you want. But the idea is it's an independent organization that is concentrating nothing about security standards
Yep.
that
it
you
is.
need to be aware of. So the
Yep.
idea is it's not coming from AWS. It's coming from a different place. But we
There
worked
it
and
is.
partnered with CIS to come up with ways
Yes, we
that
have.
you can abide by their security standards. And so this is basically, instead of every single government agency or
Mm-hmm.
every application out there trying to learn about these security standards from ground up,
Yeah.
instead they've gone and said, hey, these are things that you should be aware of, you should think about, and AWS is like, wait, we might be able to make it even easier for you by making it easy to check whether you are fulfilling your security needs.
Yep.
Is there anything else to add there?
Yeah, no, it's just another one of those security frameworks that help ensure that customers are meeting best practice. And so just like going through FedRAMP or NIST compliance or DoD CCSRG or HIPAA, CIS benchmarks kind of shows you here's the ground truth on the baseline and best practice for how to implement security within your environment.
Perfect. Yeah, so for all those building applications out there, the idea is start there. It's a great place to
It's
start,
a great place to start.
as opposed to saying, I need to become a security expert from scratch. I know,
That's
I think that's a lot to do.
That's a big climb.
The fact that some people's jobs, and you're an application developer, that's a lot to take on.
That's too many hats.
That's a lot of hats.
That is
to
a
do.
lot of hats.
Yeah, exactly. Perfect. So the idea is we have the NIST framework, we have CIS benchmarks. So you have things like setting up the NIST framework helps you set up different areas of your account.
Oh, that's okay.
Did you already go through that? I might have
No,
sidetracked you a little
that's
bit.
all right. I was going to put in a database password and actually start the framework, but this particular one is not that exciting. What is important is that it is a CloudFormation template that you
Yeah.
can try spinning up on your own and see not only how CloudFormation kind of interacts, but what it does to build that out in your environment.
Yeah. And speaking of CloudFormation, so you guys are all application developers, at least hopefully a lot
fair
of
number.
you guys. Hopefully a lot of you guys are. So the idea is you're used to taking your applications, the functionality you need to build, and codifying it. You're putting it in Java and Ruby and Python, some language, right?
Haskell.
And then at some point that gets converted into ones and zeros.
Yes.
Well, CloudFormation, again, is you describing your infrastructure in words, and it gets converted somewhere in a data center
Somewhere.
to the resources that you need. But the fact that you are describing it in words, and by words I'm talking about YAML, I'm talking about JSON.
I prefer YAML.
Yeah.
It's readable.
It's a little bit more
A
readable.
lot more readable.
A lot of tabs, but a lot less other stuff going on. The idea is that since you have codified what your infrastructure looks like, you can start to track changes
Oh, yeah.
around your infrastructure in the same way that you track changes for your code. So you know how you're using a Git repository?
I do.
Yeah.
I do.
You do things like every single time you have a new feature in your code, you're checking it in.
Sure.
You might get a peer review.
Yeah.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Well,
What's really cool though is you can take CloudFormation, and if you have a branch you want to try, you can create a branch in your repository, try something out, build your environment using that development branch, for instance, and if it works, cool, merge.
yeah.
Passes peer review, you're good to go.
Yeah.
Then you can instantiate that, and you're on your way. But you've got that entire history, so if you want to look back and see why you made those changes, it's there.
In addition to that, how many of us have set up, let's say, a development account, and then you have to go to production, or you go to staging, or you go to your testing environment, and you're like, what was that series of things I did in the console to make sure?
Alt.
Yeah, this is when I have like one incognito window, one normal browser into
Right.
both different accounts so I can see what the size of my database was in one place versus the size in another place. Remember those days?
I do.
But now that I've codified my environment,
You don't have to do it that way. Your environment can be the same because you're using CloudFormation
yeah.
to make the environments identical. So staging is the same as prod, is the same as QA, is the same as UAT, is the same as I don't know what else you're going to use, but go for it.
That's a lot of environments for you to have your application in. I really appreciate the rigor around the testing.
That's probably, that might be a bit, I don't know.
And that's good. It's all good stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, the idea that you have codified your environment, you can deploy it out into different places. You might even be able to think about a CI/CD pipeline.
Oh, I think we're going to
For
talk
your
about
infrastructure.
that
We
in
will.
a
So this
few
is-
episodes. You might
yeah.
be getting ahead of this.
Oh,
That's okay.
ruiner. Sorry. That means that you should be paying attention to maybe episode 3, maybe episode 4.
A little bit of B.
Yeah, stay tuned. So going back, so we have changes now that we have the idea of these CloudFormation changes, CloudFormation scripts. Overall, we are indicating the fact that your environment and the infrastructure in there, it might change across time,
Sure.
based off your needs. How should they be thinking about compliance and making sure that every change that they have, when they get, let's say they go to their security team and the security team has given them a thumbs up on their environment, does that mean that they should stop where they are, never make a change ever again because their application will never be,
No.
but their security team is like signed off on it, so they may have signed off for a reason.
Probably.
They might have some compliance rules that they want to abide by.
Fortunately, we have this service called AWS Config. It provides an inventory of your resources and a history of all the configurations. And I know I just read that off of the screen, but bear with me. So you can set up resources that you want to record. I just want to record all the resources in this particular region. I'm in US East 1 over here. And you give it a bucket that you want to put those resources in. This is very similar to CloudTrail, but I'm going to use the standard bucket that it gives me. Do I need to be alerted on all of these changes? That might involve.
That's a lot. That's a lot of
a lot of
lists.
changes.
Again, we want this to be action oriented for the things that really go bad. But that being said, you should continue on.
Yep. So I'm going to give the role read-only access by default, and I'm just going to hit next here. And then it gives me this set of rules. And these are rules that do compliance checks.
Yes.
And they check and see if you're in compliance. And it'll notify you if you drift out of compliance.
Yep.
So one rule that I want to do is I'm going to look at CloudTrail and CloudWatch logs. Are they enabled? So keeping CloudTrail enabled
Yep.
keeps you from having to wonder if all your API calls against the console or anywhere else are being tracked, right? So I want to do that. I'm going to turn that on right now. So I'm going to hit next. I'm just going to hit confirm. And remember, this can all be done either in a template or using the API or using the command line across the board.
Yep.
So it's going to take a minute for these to go into place. And then while the resources are being discovered, and it's going to run and it's going to do an evaluation. And when that evaluation is done, I'll have a dashboard here of rules that I'm in compliance with and rules I'm out of compliance with.
Yep.
And since I haven't set up CloudWatch yet on everything,
Yeah.
I might be out of compliance, but let's see.
So we have a question, and while that is going, we have a question from Madam, which is asking, how do I make sure a step involved in a CloudFormation template, any user could have created this template,
Right.
does not include any potential risk to security, like creating a hole or a breach that gives access to unauthorized users? Yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah. Well, so the nice thing is we already mentioned so what we're doing right now
Yes.
inside AWS Config is setting up our security standards. So it could be something along the lines of don't ever allow access on a specific port.
Sure.
We gave that small example before,
Yeah.
but it definitely goes into re-emphasizing that. You could even have things along the lines of you only allow internal users to have access to your to an application,
Sure.
as opposed to the public internet. So that's another potential use case.
Yep.
So your AWS config can pay attention to any of these requests to change your security groups,
Yep.
open up access in ways that you don't intend, and they can either alert or, like I said, you can tie a Lambda to it so it automatically switches it back to where you were before.
Yep.
So those are certain things
Yeah.
that we can do.
I think those are good steps to take.
Yeah.
Automated mitigation is a positive
Yeah.
thing.
So the idea is, oh, sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Has your screen?
Oh, it has come up, and,
good.
and it says that I have a non-compliant resource. And you can see here, you can dig in to the non-compliant resource. It says that my CloudTrail is not associated with any CloudWatch log group. So I can go fix that if I want by digging into the resource ID over here in CloudTrail. My trails, there's the resource ID. Applies to all regions, all the data events, all the storage. Oh, look, CloudWatch logs. I didn't configure it.
You should get on
set
that.
up a new or existing group. Let's just say a new group. Hit continue,
Yeah. So,
and there it is.
perfect.
So I have to give it the permission to do this, right?
Yes.
So even though this is a resource tracking things in my account, because of how we do identity and access management, I have to allow it to do this. And I'm going to let it create a new role. Let it do that's a pretty logical role name. Say allow, successful. There we go. All my logging is on. And I should be good to go when I scroll down. Unable to validate role policy, please retry. This is the fun part of doing it live.
Exactly. They like to keep us on our toes when we're up here, right?
They do. All right, let's give that a second.
While you're doing it, I did also want to have an extra follow-up to the
Sure.
last question, which is, we were mentioned, so AWS Config basically lets you put in all of your security compliance rules. And so it's always watching your account, watching any sort of changes to make sure that you're always in compliance with what you want.
Yep.
Now, what happens if who's to say someone can't come in and change the compliance rules that were ever put in here? This is, again, where we can start thinking about those IAM roles and the groups we might need. So we might want to have a group for only our security team.
Right.
And maybe they are anybody inside the security group, they are the only people who can do things like mess with AWS Config.
Absolutely.
So that would be a good thing to do. So you don't have a developer who's like, oh no, I'm in violation for a compliance rule.
Let me get rid of the rule.
Yeah, that's, I mean, like, I know every single time I create a unit test in my application and that unit test fails, guess what I do?
Pass on this.
It's just like remove the test and then I'm good to go, right?
It's probably not the best way to do it.
Yeah, so.
I'm sure nobody out there watching would ever consider that.
No, never. We don't ever have to get
Yeah, everybody writes
functionality
unit
in.
tests.
Whew. Anyway, so the idea is you can get better, which is the
Yes.
idea of thinking about that group for your security team, thinking about what sort of access your security team should have,
Yes.
and what sort of access everybody else maybe shouldn't have. So AWS Config is one of those
It is
great
one
examples.
of those great examples.
Yeah.
Just like CloudTrail and CloudWatch.
Yes.
Good things to consider, not giving everybody access to.
Coincidentally, that's actually our next thing to talk about if we are done with config.
I think we're done with config.
Okay, let's talk about centralized logging. We talked about it a little bit before
Okay.
because we set up CloudTrail,
We did.
but there's lots of other types of logging that
So,
we have.
centralized logging requires us to have more than one place, right?
Yeah,
So maybe we should start out talking about organizations.
we should, but let's even like set up the premise of why you would have multiple different AWS accounts.
Ooh.
Ooh, yes.
All right, in the time we have left, let's talk about multi-account strategy and centralized logging. So we're
Yeah.
going to try and be brief and leave room for questions.
Right. We brought up a really quick example before, which is
Yeah.
you have your dev, you
Right.
have your staging,
That's
you
a
have your
great example.
production. Do you want that all in one account?
I don't.
Why?
Well, one reason
Yep.
is limits.
Yep.
Limits are there in place to protect you from going over every particular resource utilization. You can always request your limits to be raised by cutting a ticket to support. But let's say, for instance, I have a big fleet of EC2 that I need to run a distributed application on. That's great. And I might be setting that up in my dev environment.
Right.
And that might be in a separate VPC, but I've got my production over in a different VPC in the same account.
Yes.
Well, what if my dev has a auto-scaling group placed on that particular set of EC2 instances, and it scales up? And then there's a big surge in whatever widgets or whatever I'm doing on the distributed side of the house, and my EC2 instances tries to scale up. I haven't gone and got my limits raised. All of a sudden, I've got a problem.
Yeah. Do you want your dev environment affecting your production? That feels wrong.
Yes.
So the idea is that having segregated accounts between your dev staging and production, that's one place to go. Also, if you have multiple different applications that are associated together, instead of putting them all in one place, you can put them in separate accounts. So the idea is, since you have multiple different accounts, your security team probably only wants to look at logs in one place.
Yes.
And that's where centralized logging
Centralized logging
comes
is very
into
helpful.
play.
We have a centralized logging quick start that's referenced in the blog that has a hub and spoke CloudFormation template. The hub is where the centralized logs are stored, and the spoke is to have logs pushed from the spoke account into the hub.
Yeah.
That's a pretty helpful quick start.
Yeah. It's
for
also
getting started.
at the time of an audit, your life is going to be so much easier if
Yeah.
you've centralized your logs and even put an interface on top of those logs. Look.
Right. I think there's an option in that quick start to throw Kibana in there to give people access to those logs. Of course, some of you might use Splunk.
It's totally fine.
Totally fine.
It's a great partner.
Yeah,
Yeah.
big fans. But
So-
we're being given the signal to wrap it up. So now if we have any questions, which we might or might not.
Yeah, please put in your questions right now. We will answer those final questions. Yep, so we have another question from Bello X Pace. So sorry if I got the name of your username a little bit wrong. Will there be discussions on supporting and managing multiple users, like devs, and environments they will be creating in an account?
There will now.
So yeah, I think this is a good time to do it.
We can let's start and we can bring that into the next set of discussions if we need to.
Yeah, we can always extrapolate more. Yeah, please let me know. Please let us know
Yes.
if there are places that you want us to dive into a little bit more next time.
I know in the time we have, it's around 5 minutes. That's a bigger discussion I think than we have. But that's a really good question that I think we should absolutely dig into answering.
So we'll have that as a follow-up item. So going into just to set expectations, because this is actually a great question for us to start leading into what's going to be discussed in our upcoming episodes.
Oh yeah, so we have blog posts. Some of the stuff we didn't get to cover today are going to be in those blog posts.
Next week we're going to be discussing. So here, this was just about setup of your AWS account.
This was
setting up
high
users.
level, big box.
Yes, but at some point you're going to start thinking about your application because the whole point is to secure your application.
Right.
So next week we're going to be talking about the idea of your application needs infrastructure. You're probably at a whiteboard somewhere saying like, I need a database. I need a NoSQL database in addition to that. I need search. I need application servers, and I need a load balancer in front of it. So the idea is when you're thinking about all that infrastructure you need, that needs to be secured. So we're going to be talking about security at rest, security at transit, security prevention, and detection.
Yes.
Yes. So that will be our next episode.
So join us next week. Thank you.
Bye, guys.